Imagine this. You slip on a silk dress, smooth to the touch, flawless in every stitch, and in less than a month, your skin begins to rot from the inside out. That's what happened in the spring of 1854, deep in the bluegrass country of Fayette County, Kentucky. 7 members of one of the wealthiest plantation dynasties, the Caldwell family, were dead within 30 days. Fever, open sores, delirium, and finally, death. Doctors from Louisville to Cincinnati came. They cut into the lesions, burned fabrics, tested water. Nothing made sense. It wasn't food, it wasn't plague, it wasn't contagious. Every victim, though, wore something new. A gown, a waistcoat, a riding jacket, all sewn by the same pair of hands. Her name was Dinah, a house slave, a woman whose genius was underestimated. But this isn't just a tale of revenge. No, what Dinah did, how she did it, forced historians to quietly erase her from the record, because her methods revealed something darker, a silent war fought inside the very heart of slavery itself, a war no one dared to speak of. And tonight, I'm going to tell you why. The Caldwell plantation wasn't just wealthy. It was a fortress of power. 2,300 acres of rolling bluegrass, fields heavy with tobacco, and a house built like a cathedral of control. 6 white columns, wraparound verandas. Inside, French chandeliers reflected in polished mahogany, as if even the walls wanted to remind the enslaved who owned their breath. And at the center of it all stood Samuel Caldwell. Cold, calculated. A man who treated human beings like ledgers, assets and liabilities to be optimized. 57 enslaved lives, reduced to columns of profit. Beside him, his wife Margaret, Virginia tobacco royalty, raised to believe that enslaved people were machinery to be maintained, punished, and replaced. Their children mirrored them. Thomas, cruel and ambitious, dreamed of becoming Kentucky's political voice for expanding slavery west. Mary Elizabeth, obsessed with her June wedding, a social alliance with another plantation empire. Samuel Jr., just 17, already mastering the art of psychological control over human beings. But there was one constant they all agreed on. Dinah, the house seamstress, 29 years old, brilliant hands, unshakable focus. They thought she was loyal because she smiled when expected, lowered her eyes when required, and stitched their power into every hem and cuff. What they didn't know was that Dinah had been reading books they thought she couldn't understand. Chemistry, botany, medicine. Knowledge that enslaved hands were never meant to hold. And when Samuel Caldwell threatened to sell her 14-year-old daughter, Dinah made a decision that would burn their empire from the inside out. Thread by thread, in the dead of night, when the plantation slept under the hum of cicadas, Dinah's war began. By day, she was their quiet servant, measuring, stitching, embroidering, her hands the architects of elegance. But at night, she slipped into the sewing room alone, locking the door behind her, and transformed her craft into alchemy. She had studied books hidden deep in the Caldwell library, volumes on botany, medicine, and early toxicology. She traced the margins with her fingertips, memorizing formulas forbidden to her kind. She learned how certain plants could be coaxed to yield invisible poisons, oils and essences that clung to fabric like whispers and entered the body through the skin. Pokeweed roots dried and ground to dust. Poison sumac oil extracted in secret from the swamp edges. Jimson weed seeds crushed for their alkaloids, and fungi scraped from the damp shadows of tobacco barns. Dinah blended them carefully, testing, adjusting, perfecting. She soaked threads in these silent weapons, drying them in layers until the toxins bound invisibly to the fibers. When she sewed a collar, a waistband, a cuff, she knew exactly where skin would press hardest against the fabric. Every stitch became a delivery system. every garment a clock counting down to disease, madness, and death. To the Caldwells, Dinah was making their finest spring wardrobe yet. To Dinah, she was sewing a battlefield they would wear on their bodies, and no one suspected a thing. On March 12, 1854, Margaret Caldwell stepped into her new emerald silk gown, the first masterpiece in Dinah's secret arsenal. The dress was perfect. Fitted bodice, bishop sleeves gathered with delicate precision, hundreds of tiny stitches, each a loaded weapon. Dinah's soaked threads lay hidden in the seams, a cocktail of pokeweed extract and poison sumac oil concentrated through weeks of patient preparation. A Garrett preened in the mirror, admiring herself, oblivious to the war now stitched against her skin. That afternoon she attended a ladies' luncheon at Judge Beaumont's estate, where Lexington's elite gathered to display wealth and whisper alliances. The gown drew envious stares. Compliments flowed like bourbon. Several women even begged for Dinah's services, calling her a genius with a needle. For 4 hours Margaret laughed and sipped sweet tea as the poisoned seams pressed gently into the soft skin of her neck and wrists. The toxins worked in silence, seeping through her pores, unnoticed and unstoppable. That night, as Margaret prepared for bed, she scratched at a faint itch along her neckline. By morning, it had spread into a deep, angry redness. Blisters followed, fever, delirium. Doctors called it an allergic reaction. They prescribed salves and rest. But Dinah knew better. This was only the beginning. Margaret would not be the last. Soon, every member of the Caldwell dynasty would wear their death proudly sewn into their own luxury. While Margaret suffered in silence, clawing at the blistering skin beneath her emerald silk, Dinah worked without pause. Her mask of devotion never slipped. Thomas Caldwell was next. 22. Arrogant, cruel. A man who treated the enslaved like livestock and bragged of it over bourbon. He fancied himself the future of Kentucky's pro-slavery politics, preparing to speak at a Frankfort rally in support of candidates who promised to expand human bondage westward. For such an occasion, Thomas demanded a morning coat, vest, and trousers worthy of power. Dinah nodded, measured him carefully, and selected her most dangerous preparation yet. These garments would be stitched with triple-soaked threads, each fiber steeped in a darker blend of toxins. She tested the formula on scraps, counting hours, watching how deep the poison burrowed beneath the skin. This time she aimed not just for suffering, but for collapse. Days later, Thomas strode into the State House, dazzling in his new attire, shaking hands with politicians and planters. By noon, witnesses noticed him sweating, pale beneath his charm. By dusk, his body betrayed him. Blisters spread across his neck, lips cracked, his breath ragged. Before sunset, Thomas Caldwell collapsed mid-speech, clutching his chest as the crowd screamed. The Caldwell name trembled, whispers began, and Dinah kept sewing. With Thomas bedridden and Margaret scarred, the Caldwell plantation shifted under a cloud of unease. But 17-year-old Samuel Jr., sharp, analytical, ambitious, refused to believe in coincidence. He was different from his brother, quieter, more dangerous. Samuel Jr. had spent years studying his father's techniques of psychological control, how to bend human will, how to break resistance without spilling blood. To him, power was mathematics, numbers, yields, leverage, fear. When he requested a new riding, jacket and trousers for an upcoming hunting expedition, Dinah felt the stakes change. This boy wasn't just another spoiled heir. He watched people, he noticed patterns. She had to be perfect. For Samuel Jr., she devised a refined toxin, a slower burn, a deeper cruelty. She treated the jacket's collar and cuffs with an oil distilled from Jimson weed seeds, its alkaloids engineered to seep beneath the skin and assault the nervous system over time. Days later, he wore it into the woods, laughing with neighboring planters as hounds bayed in the distance. Hours passed before he felt it. The dizziness, the heat crawling up his neck, the strange confusion clouding his thoughts. By nightfall, he was back in his bed, shaking violently, his torso covered in angry, weeping lesions. Doctors puzzled over the sickness. Not contagious, they whispered, not foodborne, not water. Samuel Jr. studied them with glassy, fevered eyes, and somewhere in his collapsing mind, suspicion began to bloom. The household felt it too. Fear now had a scent, sweat, rot, and silk. But Dinah was still invisible. By late March, the Caldwell mansion had become a sickroom of secrets. Margaret drifted in and out of fevered delirium, her once perfect skin scarred and weeping. Thomas lay unconscious in Frankfurt, his body failing. Samuel Jr. burned under sheets that stank of pus and salves, and yet none of it spread. The doctors were baffled. Theories flew like gnats. Tainted water, foul air, cursed bedding. None fit. None explained why only Caldwells were falling while the enslaved, who cooked their meals, laundered their linens, and dressed their wounds, remained untouched. Samuel Caldwell, the patriarch, refused coincidence. He hired 2 private investigators from Louisville, men with faces like carved stone, trained to hunt conspiracies. They interviewed neighbors, searched the stables, questioned the enslaved with cold precision. They even tested the family's food, their bourbon, their well water. Nothing. Every thread led nowhere, because the real weapon was hiding in plain sight. Dinah watched them carefully, never breaking character. Her hands were always busy, darning linens, mending lace, whispering obedience through every gesture. To them, she was indispensable, invisible. But in the silent hours before dawn, she was something else entirely, a tactician perfecting her war. The next garments she prepared weren't just clothing. They were execution orders. The targets, Samuel Caldwell himself, and his sister-in-law, Catherine Henley, the most vicious of them all. Dinah was no longer avenging her daughter. She was dismantling an empire. Samuel Caldwell had built his empire on control, over his land, his family, his wealth, and the lives of those he owned. But now, control was slipping through his fingers like bourbon on cracked glass. He barely slept. He stalked the halls at night, a loaded pistol in one hand, a half-empty decanter in the other, muttering about curses and traitors. He demanded every servant be searched daily. Food was tasted before reaching his lips. Letters were intercepted. Guests turned away. But none of his precautions could save him. When Samuel ordered a tailored morning coat for an upcoming public speech, an appearance meant to project strength while his children withered, Dinah obeyed with quiet precision. She soaked the inner lining with a tincture extracted from monkshood root, a paralytic so potent it was known as the Queen of Poisons. Unlike the earlier toxins, this one was mercilessly direct. On April the 2nd, Samuel stood before a crowd outside the courthouse, his voice booming with false confidence. Then it faltered. A tremor shook his jaw. His knees buckled. Witnesses described his skin turning ashen grey, his breath rattling like splintered glass. By nightfall, he lay in his grand 4-poster bed, paralyzed but conscious, eyes wide and wet with terror. He couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't even summon his investigators. Only Dinah entered his chamber, silent, unhurried. She adjusted his blankets, her fingers grazing the very coat that betrayed him. For the first time in his life, Samuel Caldwell understood powerlessness. And Dinah wasn't finished. Catherine Henley was the kind of woman who could poison a room with a single glance. Samuel Caldwell's widowed sister-in-law, she ruled the social salons of Lexington with an iron tongue. Years earlier, she had stood on the porch of the slave quarters, fanning herself, while Dinah's 6-year-old daughter Lottie was whipped for spilling milk. Catherine had smiled as the child screamed. Dinah never forgot that smile. Now, Catherine was next. Unlike Margaret and Thomas, Catherine prided herself on suspicion. She trusted no one, especially the enslaved. Dinah couldn't risk another soaked seam or treated cuff. Catherine would notice. Instead, she devised something far subtler. Catherine adored pearl chokers, wearing them tight enough to leave faint red grooves around her throat. Dinah polished the pearls using a cloth laced with a powder of dried foxglove petals, a deadly cardiac toxin that entered the bloodstream through microscopic abrasions in the skin. 2 days later, at a charity tea for Lexington's elite, Catherine arrived resplendent, pearls gleaming under the spring sun. By mid-afternoon, her heart raced uncontrollably. Her breath came in shallow bursts. Witnesses said she clutched at her throat, pearls digging into soft flesh, as if strangling her. Then she collapsed, teacup shattering in her hand. The Caldwell mansion exploded with whispers and dread. 4 members of the dynasty had fallen, yet the servants, every one of them, remained untouched. That night, Samuel Jr., fevered and trembling, whispered hoarsely to his mother, "It's not sickness, Mama. Someone's killing us." And for the first time, Margaret believed him. By mid-April, the Caldwell mansion had transformed into a fortress of dread. Locks were reinforced, windows sealed, meals were tested by 3 different servants before reaching the family table. Investigators returned, this time, armed not just with questions but with threats. They prowled the halls at night, dragging enslaved men into the stables, demanding confessions through clenched fists and boiling water. But fear breeds silence, and Dinah moved like smoke between the cracks of suspicion. Still, she knew the circle was tightening. One wrong glance, one misplaced whisper, one trembling hand, and the entire plan would collapse. So Dinah changed her tactics. No more direct poisons, no more obvious symptoms. She began working on the mind. She planted seeds in the servants' quarters, murmuring in hushed tones where she knew certain ears would carry tales upstairs. Rumors of a curse upon the Caldwell bloodline. Whispers of a buried slave woman beneath the magnolia tree, angry and vengeful. At night, she crept through hidden passageways, leaving faint scratches on bedroom doors, tiny tufts of hair beneath pillows, and smearing animal blood on windowsills. The results were immediate. Margaret prayed until her knees bled. Samuel Jr., fevered and paranoid, accused servants at random. Catherine's surviving relatives demanded the family leave Lexington altogether. But the investigators were relentless. One, a former Pinkerton agent named Elias Hargrove, started watching Dinah closely. He tracked her movements, counted her hours. Dinah could feel his gaze like a blade on her neck. She knew what she had to do next. Hargrove had to disappear. Elias Hargrove wasn't like the others. A former Pinkerton agent, he'd hunted killers across 6 states, priding himself on an instinct for liars. He didn't believe in curses, ghosts, or hexes. He believed in patterns. And Dinah's quiet, efficient movements, always there, always unseen, were a pattern he couldn't ignore. So she studied him in return. Hargrove was methodical. He rose before dawn, catalogued his observations in a black leather journal, and kept a flask of rye whiskey in his coat. But Dinah noticed something deeper. He had a soldier's wound in his left shoulder, an old musket ball scar that stiffened when damp. She waited for rain. On April 19th, as a storm rolled over Lexington, Hargrove followed her into the attic storeroom, convinced she'd hidden something there. What he didn't know was that Dinah had spent weeks preparing that space. Behind stacked crates and fabric rolls, she'd sewn human hair into the rafters, nailed animal bones into the walls, and hung tiny leather pouches filled with powdered pokeweed and grave dirt. When Hargrove entered, lantern in hand, the air itself seemed to thicken. The scent of decay clung to him. "I know it's you," he rasped. "I'll have your confession before sunrise." Dinah said nothing. She simply blew a pinch of powder into the lantern flame. It hissed, sending up a plume of acrid smoke. Within minutes, Hargrove's breath quickened. Sweat poured. His scar flared white-hot with pain. He stumbled, dizzy, swearing he heard whispers in the walls. By morning, he was gone, fled Lexington on horseback, leaving his badge, his journal, and his sanity behind. Dinah hadn't touched him. She didn't need to. Now the Caldwells were defenseless. Margaret Caldwell had once been the jewel of Lexington society. Now she was a ghost, trapped in silk and bone. Her reflection terrified her. Blistered neck, raw hands, hollow, low cheeks. She had stopped attending church, stopped writing letters, stopped leaving her room entirely. But the worst change wasn't on her skin. It was in her mind. Dinah made sure of it. Every night, Margaret heard faint scratching at her door, the sound of tiny feet scurrying across the floorboards. Once she woke to find her wedding veil draped across the bed, soaked in something sticky and red. Another time, she discovered her mother's rosary beads laid neatly across her pillow, tied into a noose. No one else heard the sounds. No one else saw the signs. Margaret began begging Samuel Jr. to leave the house, insisting the mansion was cursed. But he was too fevered, too paranoid, his body failing day by day. Dinah turned the knife deeper. One morning, she presented Margaret with a new morning gown, black silk, soft as breath. Margaret hesitated, but exhaustion won. She slipped it on, unaware the lining had been treated with a diluted infusion of ergot fungus. Within hours, Margaret's visions began. Shadows moved where there were none. She swore she heard Lottie's cries echoing through the halls. By midnight she was screaming that the walls were bleeding. The doctors called it hysteria. Samuel Jr. called it punishment from God. Dinah called it justice. And there was still one Caldwell left who hadn't yet suffered enough. By the last week of April, Samuel Jr. was little more than a shadow of the calculating heir he once was. His body burned with fever, his skin blotched with angry lesions, but his mind was what Dinah wanted most. She began starving him of certainty. Every time he asked a question, she gave him an answer that contradicted the last. When he demanded fresh linens, she brought back ones faintly damp, as if recently washed of something unseen. She whispered prayers in Gullah under her breath whenever she passed his doorway, a language Samuel didn't understand, but one he feared instinctively. Soon he stopped sleeping. He'd sit upright for hours, shotgun in his lap, flinching at every creak of the floorboards. At night, Dinah left small scratches on his windowsill and rubbed iron filings into his boots so that each step sparked against the wooden floor. Samuel became convinced he was being hunted by spirits. Then came the final push. She crafted for him a waistcoat lined with threads soaked in a tincture of belladonna and oil of savin, slow-working, designed to blur the edges between reality and nightmare. Within days, Samuel Jr. stopped recognizing his own reflection. He screamed at shadows. He accused his mother of conspiring against him. And on the night of April 28th, witnesses said he walked barefoot into the tobacco fields, muttering Lottie's name over and over, before collapsing face first into the soil. By dawn, the Caldwell heir was gone. The mansion, once a monument to power, had become a tomb. But Dinah wasn't finished yet. There was still one last act to deliver, a message carved not in whispers, but in blood and fire. On the night of May the 1st, 1854, a strange silence settled over the Caldwell plantation. The wind died, the crickets fell mute, even the hounds in the kennels refused to bark, as if some unspoken warning had crept through the air. Inside the mansion, Margaret lay delirious in her sickbed, whispering the rosary through cracked lips. Catherine's relatives had fled weeks earlier. Samuel Jr. was buried beneath the cold, damp earth. And Samuel Caldwell, still paralyzed from Dinah's poisoned coat, stared blankly at the canopy above him, a king locked inside his own flesh. Dinah moved like a ghost, silent, unseen. For weeks she had been preparing this night, stitching her vengeance into every fibre of the house. Candles dipped in rendered tallow and saltpeter lined the hallways. Strips of linen soaked in lamp oil were coiled beneath the grand staircase. In the attic, she'd hidden jars of powdered black powder, disguised among bolts of fabric. At exactly 11:47 p.m., Dinah lit the first fuse. The fire spread fast, hungry and unstoppable. It raced along the oiled banisters, devoured the curtains, crawled up the walls like living shadow. Within minutes, smoke swallowed the upper floors. Margaret's screams tore through the night as flames licked at her chamber door. Servants scattered into the fields, their silhouettes lit in orange against the dark. And in the chaos, Dinah walked calmly out the back door, her face glowing in the firelight. Behind her, the Caldwell dynasty, its blood, its wealth, its secrets, burned to ash. But this wasn't the end. Because Dinah hadn't vanished into the smoke. She had plans, and the fire was only the beginning of the legend. By dawn, the Caldwell mansion was nothing but a blackened skeleton against the pale Kentucky sky. Neighbors gathered along the dirt road, silent and wide-eyed, as the last embers hissed in the morning dew. Of the Caldwell bloodline, none remained whole. Margaret's charred body was found curled beneath her rosary. Samuel Caldwell, the patriarch, was discovered still in bed, his flesh fused to the mattress, his eyes burned to glass. Word traveled fast. By sundown, whispers spread through Lexington's salons and taverns. The Caldwells were cursed. God struck them down. It's the price of sins unpaid. But among the enslaved, the whispers carried a different weight. Some said Dinah fled west with a handful of freedmen, disappearing into the wild hills. Others swore she wandered the back roads at night, face veiled in ash, offering quiet blessings to those who'd suffered under Caldwell chains. And then came the stories no one wanted to write down. Farmhands claimed they'd seen Lottie's ghost wandering the tobacco fields, her white dress untouched by soot, her voice like wind through hollow wood. Hunters reported finding strange symbols carved into trees along the property's edge, circles, crosses, spirals, as if someone was marking the land for something unfinished. In the following months, every would-be buyer of the Caldwell estate backed out. Cattle died without cause, workers vanished, children woke screaming from dreams of burning silk. The land itself seemed haunted, and Dinah's name became a warning. Parents whispered it to silence unruly children. Preachers invoked it from pulpits as proof of God's wrath. But in the quarters and back alleys, Dinah wasn't a demon. She was justice sown by hand. Summer came, and the Caldwell ruins stood silent beneath a canopy of heavy, choking heat. Grass crept over scorched foundations. Vines wrapped around the blackened bones of the mansion. Birds avoided the place entirely, as though even nature remembered the screams. But beneath the ashes, something still lived. 3 months after the fire, a farmhand named Ezekiel Moore wandered near the ruins, looking for stray cattle. He swore he heard a faint knocking beneath the earth, rhythmic, deliberate. He followed the sound to the collapsed cellar door. When he pried it open, a stench like rotting silk poured out. Inside, he found a survivor, Catherine Henley, burned, scarred, half-mad, but alive. In the weeks that followed, Catherine told anyone who would listen that the fire was no accident. She whispered about poisoned seams, haunted garments, and a woman who stitched death into silk. She begged the courts to investigate Dinah, to hunt her across Kentucky, to burn her like a witch. But Dinah was already gone. Some claimed she escaped to New Orleans, working as a seamstress under a new name, serving the secretive circles of the wealthy and powerful. Others said she'd joined an underground gullah society, her poisoned stitches traded like sacred knowledge. And then there were darker tales. That Dinah didn't flee at all, but chose to stay, living in the shadows of the ruins, watching anyone who dared step onto Caldwell land. Even now, locals whisper, if you pass the old Caldwell grounds at night, don't look toward the house, and for God's sake, don't wear silk. Because some say Dinah's poisoned stitches still exist, hidden in trunks, tucked into attics, passed down through hands that don't know the danger they carry. Somewhere a dress waits, somewhere a coat breathes death, and somewhere Dinah Caldwell's revenge isn't finished.